All right, in the interest of time, we'll get started as people get in. Priyanga will continue with her second lecture.
Which is yet to come. I also got a bag to go with my outfit today. So, okay, so last time we ended up talking about how coexistence can occur solely through nonlinear interactions between species. And we worked on we learned one mechanism, trade-offs with intragroup predation, and you got to play with a little bit of computer code yesterday to understand invisibility. And today I want to quick cover the second mechanism, after which I will go to my second lecture, okay? So this is a remnant from last week's lecture. So here, this mechanism is called relative nonlinearity. And I'm going to illustrate it with our favorite species interaction, exploitative competition. Now we've seen a model of exploitative competition before with linear functional responses, and we found that the R-star rule operates, right? We are all concerned. We are all on the same page about that the species that drives the resource level to the lowest level wins in competition. Now, when you have exploitative competition with species exhibiting nonlinear functional responses, you can get coexistence through a mechanism called relative nonlinearity, the term given to it by Peter Chesson. And this arises in general through saturating functional responses grid, which most species in nature tend to exhibit. Oops, I knew that. Okay, thank you. Now we've seen this before, right? You've seen this before. The handling time of the consumer generates this saturating functional response, and with the important consequence that the resource is underexploited when it's abundant, right? Now we've been through this, so I'm hoping that you can move forward quickly. But this leads to, as we saw, positive feedback in the resource species growth rate. Now, okay, so here's a model that illustrates the nonlinear function. So this is the model of exploitative competition that you saw before. The only difference is now we have saturating functional responses. Sorry, okay, something wrong. That is here, weird. Looking at an empty screen. Here, those are saturating functional responses, okay? Everything else is the same. Now we can see that just the mere addition of this biological feature can lead to very different outcomes. So here is the argument. The consumers can differ because when they have nonlinear exhibit these saturating functional responses, they can differ in the degree of nonlinearity in their functional response. And that comes from differences in handling time, because as we saw, it's the handling time that generates the nonlinearity. Are we happy about that? We all understand that, right? So the longer the handling time, the more nonlinear the functional response. So here's an illustration of it. Here's the resource density. This is the functional response, which is the per capita consumption rate. And you can see consumer 1, which has a longer handling time, saturates at a lower resource density. Consumer 2, which has a shorter handling time, saturates at a much higher resource density. Clearly, consumer 1 has the more nonlinear functional response, right? So nonlinearity is the slope. Well, wouldn't it seem to you to be more, this one is more nonlinear because that's more like a line, right? You can actually quantify the slope of the curve, which is changes with resource density. So this can happen in nature because no two consumer species is the same. And we know that already the longer the handling time, more nonlinear the functional response, the more likely it is that the consumer oscillations that are resulting will be stronger. Okay.
Good question. Why do you stop at 2 species?
Well, because we start, of course, but we start with 2 species, we can understand the simple case, then we proceed to more. Okay, right. So to understand how this mechanism works, we are going to first look at consumer resource dynamics when each consumer persists in isolation with the resource in the absence of the pairwise interaction, in other words. Okay. So here are the temporal dynamics of the 2 consumers when each exists in isolation with the resource. You can see consumer 1 had the more nonlinear response, right? So it actually generates permanent fluctuations in abundance. In this particular case, it's a stable limit cycle. Consumer 2, which had the the shorter handling time, actually exists at a stable equilibrium. It's called a stable focus because it's approached via damped oscillation. So we can see there is a distinct difference in dynamics. Yeah.
I missed something, Priyanga. I didn't follow why the first consumer on its own causes the.
Because it has a longer handling time and a more nonlinear functional response. Because.
Then what destabilizes the
Well, here. So it's this, right? So below this resource density, you have stronger consumer control, right? Relative to the, so when you have a longer handling time. It's a very good question. Does everybody understand? This is what I said about building very quickly on the things I said in the first lecture. Not my day. I don't think that didn't happen the last time. Anyway, okay. All right, so that's, there's a mathematical treatment of this in an old paper, very good paper. If you haven't read it, you should, by Armstrong and McGehee. And I will go through their argument, okay? So we already know that if they have linear functional responses, the R star rule would operate and the consumer with the higher attack rate would exclude the other. But when they have nonlinear functional responses, the species with the more nonlinear response generates fluctuations in abundances. And here's the crucial thing. If the average resource abundance over the period of the cycle exceeds the R star values of both consumers, then they can coexist. You understand what the importance of this. There is no environmental variation that causes resource fluctuations. That's why when the resource density is fixed at equilibrium, it's the consumers that determine the actual equilibrium resource level because they tend to exploit it at different levels, and there's no escaping that inevitability, right? But if a consumer happens to have a long enough handling time that completely sense the dynamic of this bifurcation, the system goes from a stable focus to limit cycles, eventually to divergent oscillations. We are not interested in that. So in that case, that species handling time now causes the resource to fluctuate over time in the absence of any external forcing, right? That means it is no longer controlled by the species exploitation of the resource because the resource now fluctuates by virtue of that species' longer handling time, which is there for the duration of the time being. It is not going to evolve a shorter handling time in the time frame of ecological dynamics. And generally, that can't happen because these are things like jaw size, teeth size. So you are not going to evolve a different foraging strategy within a reasonable time frame, if at all, right? So this is a really important thing. Keep this in mind, because this is, you will find out, and I'll tell you, this is a much more general mechanism than just functional response differences. Yeah, you know, my life would be so much better if I were good at things like that. Right, so here, so coexistence here occurs through, so the first thing is that the dynamics of the pairwise, one of the pairwise, or more than one, generates these fluctuations, which now means that the resource abundance is not constant over time, right? So we can work this out. There are going to be times when it exceeds the R star value of the inferior competitor, right? So what happens here is this. The consumer with the less nonlinear functional response. Now think about this. What does that mean? It has a relatively higher tag rate and a short handling time. What is it limited by? It just wants as much resource, right? Because it doesn't it has a short handling time. It's not limited by that. So a species like that is better at resource exploitation when the resource abundance is high. In contrast, the consumer with the more nonlinear functional response, the longer handling time, is better at resource exploitation when the resource abundance is low. Why? Because we already know from the functional response, with a type 2 functional response and a highly nonlinear one in the figure I showed you, the resource is underexploited when it's abundant with a species that has a longer handling time. So there is a period where the resource is open to exploitation by another species, and as a result.
Question regarding this. So in some sense, is it like the two competitors, by the virtue of their traits, consume resources in such a way that they push the resource concentration into a regime where the other species is?
It's not them together, actually. It's the resident consumer. If it happens to have a higher handling time, will already be exhibiting cycles, and during the high phases of which that consumer is ineffective. And if the abundance at the high phase exceeds the R star of the inferior competitor, it can invade at that time. But as long as, since it's integrated over the period of the cycle, as long as the overall average abundance exceeds the species R star, then it can persist even at the low ends, because you build up, then you ride out the low when the period of the troughs of the fluctuations, where the other species is actually better. Okay? Yeah.
So these are not when all three components are together at the same time. And how is this model? So there are two species that come from reason and then it makes it, or are they all?
No. So you can show that if there is a consumer and you have a pairwise interaction, and that consumer tends to increase the resource abundance through the fluctuations, as long as the average resource abundance over the cycle, this is what the Armstrong and McGee show, and you can just do this on the computer with 2 lines code. And as long as that's true, the other species can invade when well. And when that species is there, since its R star is higher anyway, the species with the more nonlinear, that's a no-show, right? So it's actually a one-way thing. So you can actually see that by just simulating, like, write the model, and if you invade them, then it happens. On its own, Roger Nisbet and I have had lots of discussions about it. On its own, it's actually not, like for regular parameter values, it's not a very common mechanism in the sense of, if you just did it over some arbitrary parameter space, you may not see coexistence, because all of the mortality birth rates of the species have to work in a way that the R stars work with the phase of the cycle. So here's the thing. So since the two consumers exploit different parts of the cycle, tell me how that generates the requirement for species to limit themselves more than they limit others. What is the requirement for coexistence? Species must limit themselves more than they limit others, right? So if these two species can exploit different parts of the resource cycle, whom do they interact with when they're exploiting that? Themselves, right? So that is why it's a form of resource partition, kind of a very cool one, actually, when you think about it, because there's nothing else going on but the intrinsic dynamics. And if that's possible, then you get coexistence. Ultimately, as I said at the tutorial, all coexistence mechanisms work through that fundamental requirement, right? Yes.
This might be a slightly stupid question, but then when you, in the event of invasion, that gently impacts stable cycles of the resource that shift the overall cycle lower simply because there are more normal distributions.
That doesn't happen, because the second species has a lower handling time. right? So if it doesn't alter the nonlinearity of the originals, the cycles generated by the originals, because the second species has a more linear functional response. So it doesn't change the nonlinearity through that. If you had a more nonlinear one, then actually it would be difficult because that would have a different kind of R star. So it's interesting, yeah. So the thing, that's what I was going to say. So the issue here is it doesn't have to be functional responses that they're different in. Whatever the traits that go into their R stars, which as I told you yesterday, are actually their lifetime reproductive successes. Whatever traits that go into the lifetime reproductive success of a consumer, right? If the inverse of that, which is the R star, whatever mechanisms that increases resource abundance through these intrinsically generated oscillations, that increases the average resource abundance above the R star of the most inferior competitor would allow. So for example, if you include developmental delays into population dynamics of ectotherms, you get delayed feedback cycles, generation cycles. In that case, these species can have identical functional responses, but can differ in their developmental delay, and you still get coexistence. In fact, much easier than this one, right? Because it is not one trait that matters. Delays cause cycles. Why do you get consumer resource oscillations? Why do they happen in the first place? Even the Lotka-Volterra neutral perturbator model gets consumer resource oscillations, right? Why do they occur? You need a mic, huh? Yes, there is a delay between consumption for aging and the translation of that energy into reproduction, which is why the predator lags behind the prey, because it takes some time for it to build up in abundances, during which the resource escapes, right? Then the predator, how many of you actually learn this in terms of prey escape and resource overexploitation in your classes? No one. No one. When you learn the first Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, how many of you have actually done that? If not pronto, you go learn that. Okay, so just because I'm telling you, there's a reason why that model is kind of, it's neutral, and you could say that's not useful. On the other hand, it still generates this, and that's the value of that model, because without any other stabilizing mechanism, you simply have the delay, and because of the delay, you get this prey escape. You understand, right? Like you've seen this, like the prey increases, predator increases, prey goes down. And it's those alternating periods of prey escape and predator exploitation that leads to consumer resource cycles. A stable limit cycle is one where you have some resource density dependence, and therefore it becomes a stable attractor. If you move away from the limit cycle, you come back. In a neutral model, if you move away from it, it fluctuates at a different amplitude because it's dependent on initial abundances, okay? All right. Matthew. Oh, Krishna.
Is it possible to actually kind of massage the time scales or handling time in some fun way, so that by the time that the resource is kind of been exploited, the other one can't be made?
You mean the second species? You mean you can prevent coexistence? You don't have to do that much. They have to be different in enough. Like I would do that if that meant something, like to say, and in fact, most of the time you can't get coexistence through simple differences in attack rates and handling times. It is difficult. It's a very narrow. No, so think about it. So in order to get oscillations, you have to have the kind of functional response with a long enough handling time, strong enough attack, high enough attack rate. In fact, the consumer with the more nonlinear functional response can only maintain itself if it has a higher attack rate and a longer handling time. Because when you have a very long handling time, if you have a low attack rate and the resource is scarce, you're never going to get anywhere, right? So actually it has the overall advantage, which is very hard to overcome unless that the second species has the right degree of lower nonlinearity. That's why I said this mechanism itself can be restrictive, But there are many other ways of generating intrinsic cycles, especially through developmental delays, which is a real feature of organisms. And then there are easier ways to, so what I'm saying is it's a much more general mechanism, okay? The only thing that matters is that the average resource abundance, it doesn't have to be a limit cycle, whatever, it could be aperiodic, but there is a period that matters for the species lifespan, right? And then it should work. Matthew, we had a question.
Stop. Yes. It's a question. You're very free not to answer it if it feels like going into the weeds. I always try to understand in the JSON type of framework the difference between storage effect, relative non-linearity, and these kind of things when talking about this kind. Could you tell me how this is not, for instance? I mean.
Yeah. So I can. In fact, I will do the storage effect in my next lecture.
Perfect.
But I can tell you right now. In the storage effect, you have external variation through the abiotic environment. And species differ in their responses to the abiotic environment. You do not have internally, so here there is no, so this is a more restrictive mechanism. That is why it's harder to show in a model, because there's absolutely, in a constant abiotic environment, right? The model is exactly that model. There's nothing going on. So it's very biologically different. This is the species generating the oscillations on their own intrinsically. And that doesn't work in the storage effect, is because that is basically spatial or temporal niche partitioning. You're actually using the resource at different times or different places, not the different phases of the resource cycle, right? So that's why it's actually, it took me a long time to distinguish between these things too, because of the way they're presented. But that's a very, yeah, that's the thing. And generally, this is brought up as a mechanism that can occur even if you didn't have temperature variation or moisture variation or things like that. That's a very good point. Did everyone? So you will learn the storage effect in the next lecture. And these are like really important mechanisms that you should all know, because they are seemingly sophisticated and sort of, they are sophisticated, but there are simple ways of understanding them, okay? Yes, Saswin.
Resource positive feedback?
No, so the thing is, if you have a longer handling time,
right,
then the positive feedback is stronger. And the fluctuations are, I'm sorry, I can't show you the slide. Yeah. So remember, you probably have it in your notes, like I gave you the notes, right? Remember the unimodal one? So when the positive feed, remember like the maximum was towards the left in that. When you have very strong positive feedback, the maximum goes to the right, meaning the portion of the resource density in which negative density dependence operates is reduced relative to the portion. So for a longer, so it will go, right? Like that. So you can actually play around with that, the critical resource density. I have a paper, it's Johnson and Amarasekare 2015 in AMNAC, that deals with this entire thing fully. So you can go look at it. There are different cases, and you can work that out. Okay? Yeah, so these are very good questions that, you know, it's not just so that's why it's stronger, and that's not damped oscillations. The reason you have damped oscillations is because it's an inherently oscillatory system, right? So it has that tendency, and it's damped because of the resource self-limitation being strong enough. So that's the other thing. If this positive feedback is very strong relative to how the resource is limited by its own, you know, nutrients or whatever, then you are more likely to get fluctuations. So it's a balance between these two always. And in nature, for example, you know, these could change even in the same system during different times and places. Okay. Okay, so we saw, let me just quickly summarize, and I'm going to try as much as possible from just, you know, talking to you. So basically what we saw was we were after looking at ways in which coexistence could occur solely through nonlinear interactions between species, right? And we went from pairwise to 3 species, and we stopped at 3 species because it's still analytically tractable, and it gives you the foundation to look at more complex communities. And we found 2 things. One is this coexistence through trade-offs that actually trade-offs alone don't generate coexistence, but if they lead to some sort of resource partitioning, then that means that you species limit themselves more than they limit others, as I was telling in the tutorial. So then you can get coexistence. And the second one, which is quite different, is that consumers can have long handling times by virtue of the foods they eat, and that can generate these nonlinear dynamics, right? Intrinsically generated fluctuations in resource abundance, which allow species with lower R star values to still coexist, higher R star values to coexist if the average resource abundance exceeds the most inferior competitors' R star. And that's a general mechanism because resource fluctuation through any kind of intrinsically generated mechanism can allow this coexistence as long as the average resource abundance exceeds the R star of the most inferior competitor, okay? So it's actually kind of an interesting, this whole developmental delay thing is really interesting because that's an inherent thing. Species have them. You have to, your life cycle takes a certain amount of time. And there's also then temperature and all these other things, but quite apart from any of that, simply being different in fast versus slow developing species, you could coexist, which is something you don't even think about. If the adult stage is what exploit the resource, but the juveniles differ in the developmental time, that can translate into coexistence. Okay? They're both exploitative, but that one it can keep going and exploit more resources even at higher resource densities because it doesn't take as much time to process one food item. So the handling time is the time it takes for you to peel something off and put it in your mouth and get it into your stomach, right? So when you have a less nonlinear functional response, the one that keeps going means you do it very quickly, so you keep eating. That means you can actually suppress the resource at a high, up until a higher level. If you take a long time to process each food item, since you have finite time to forage, then you saturate your maximum. So the other thing, perhaps this would help you. So what I've used, the functional response, that is the Halling form. So this functional response was developed by Buzz Halling, C.S. Halling, because he was really interested. He's a Canadian zoologist because he was interested in these limitations by gut capacity. Now in enzyme kinetics, you use the exact same thing. It's called Monod function, right? In that case, it's 1 over H, so you can go from one to the other. Not ready. Oh, okay. No, that's okay. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so this is done.
Excuse me. Can I just finish the question? Yeah.
What?
No, I just had second part to that question.
Oh.
You mentioned that.
Could we do that at the end?
Okay.
Because I'd like to get through the second lecture as much as possible. Thank you. Which means. Right. So I'm going to skip all this because this is just the preamble. Yeah. So we've done that, right? We've done that first question. Can nonlinearities arising from species interactions alone lead to diversity? And now we want to look at the second thing I posted at the beginning. Now we want to get to the now that we really understand that, we want to get to the interplay between nonlinearity and environmental variation. That is the abiotic environment, temperature, rainfall, pH, salinity, okay? And there are two aspects to it, 2 dimensions, spatial and temporal. Today we are going to talk about spatial variation. Now this and my third lecture, these 2 lectures are going to introduce you to ideas you may not have been familiar with before. So here I'm not going to spend time deriving things because I don't have the time. My goal has been to try to leave you with a certain degree of knowledge that if you're interested, then you can build on, okay? So I'm going to try to expose you to a whole lot of ideas, including some very cutting edge things. So if you didn't understand how a particular invasion criterion was derived, but you're interested sufficiently, I'm thinking that you're all very smart, you can go and look it up or derive it yourself. Okay, my goal here is to give you as many important ideas as I can in the time. So with that, so this is when you're looking at the spatial variation, we want to think about the spatial structure of the landscape. So the local scale is where you have communities. We've been looking at them, right? These communities have local dynamics that arise from species interactions. That's the scale at which you have the R star, P star rules operating. Then we have the regional scale, right? Now we are going back, right? We're getting in a helicopter and looking at the whole thing, which is the scale where I have a collection of communities. We call that which we call them meta communities, right? And this occurs at what we call the regional scale. And you have regional spatial dynamics generally operates at that stage. So this is what's called so you have, going from there to here, you have variability. And the important thing that I want to show you is that the interplay between local dynamics and spatial variation can lead to emergent properties at the regional scale. And this is what Peter Chesson calls the scale transition. Okay, so very important idea. Now, now here, this is really important. Spatial variation, when I say spatial variation, it doesn't simply mean variation in the abiotic environment. That's always there, right? It's hardly a constant environment out there. What I mean is, by spatial variation is spatial heterogeneity in the biotic environment. The spatial variation in the abiotic environment generates some sort of difference in the way the species interact with one another, okay, organisms. So this is because, for the important reason that spatial variation in the abiotic environment matters only if it generates spatial variation in fitness, okay? So for that to happen, we have to have spatial variation in biotic interactions like competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism. And so this is a harder problem, somewhat, but not really. So we are going to now look at it. Here's what happens, and then we are going to go see whether we can understand it. When you have a spatially heterogeneous biotic environment, spatial variation in the environment generates spatial variation in density-dependent feedback loops, right? What does that mean? Very simply put, the density, the strength or nature of density or frequency dependence is not the same everywhere. Do you see why that might matter? That's a spatially heterogeneous biotic environment. It has a very specific meaning, okay? It doesn't even mean that there are lions here and hippos here, right? It means that the interactions generate, the feedbacks generated have either different strengths or different natures. So this is when the biotic environment is spatially heterogeneous, individuals can respond by dispersing between habitats in a way that they maximizes fitness. So the resulting interplay between local non-linearity and spatial variation can allow coexistence of species that might otherwise exclude each other. And that's what you're going to find out. Yeah.
So if I can just clarify how, because I think both of those things still apply to spatial variation and abiotic factors as well. That there's also dispersion related fitness maxima you can find if there is spatial variability in abiotic factors as well.
No, you don't. You do only because it makes a difference to the fitness. Just because temperature varies doesn't matter if the species per capita growth rate is not affected by temperature, right? So when you say that, you're saying what I'm saying. Because you're saying, see, think about it. So say it's cold and warm, and species do better in the warm environment. They do better in the warm environment because the temperature difference doesn't matter if the species didn't respond to it by being closer to its optima, right? So that's what I'm saying. Because there's a tendency to celebrate the variation in the environment and say that must allow coexistence. It's a harder problem than that, okay? So we are going to look at the interplay between local dynamics and spatial variation with our favorite species interaction, but I'm just going to introduce a new one, So we've done competition and predation, right? Consumer resource. We are going to look at mutualistic interactions. Hopefully, right, start with exploitative competition in spatially varying environments. So here, what does this mean? Now we are in a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. That means the spatial variation in the abiotic environment causes spatial heterogeneity in competitive interactions such that the strength of intra and interspecific competition is not the same everywhere, okay? Right. So here's a cartoon to represent that idea. So you say we are just using two so you can understand this. It can be many localities. There's locality 1 and locality 2. Locality 1 is favorable to the species 1 because of some abiotic environmental feature. That is more moist, right? And since it's a local community, within it, everything is uniform. Species favorable to species 1, species 2 gets excluded. Now, however, since the abiotic environment changes, there can be some other locality that happens to be unfavorable to species 1, say it's much drier, then it's favorable to species 2, species 1 can be excluded. So you can see that the abiotic variation can change competitive rankings, and indeed we see this in nature all the time. Now, what you get is when you look at one patch, one locality, you have one species or low diversity, right? But you expand your investigation to the entire regional scale, what you see is species do coexist, right? At that larger scale, because this one's here, this one's here. So that's what's called regional coexistence of competing species. Now, look at this graph. Remember I said, so we have local dynamics, we have variability, that leads to regional dynamics, and regional diversity is different from local diversity, because if you went to one patch and you studied it, you're only going to see the species that are there. But if you studied a lot of patches, then you're going to see different species. So that's the interplay, that's the scale transition. Spatial variation in competitive ability across the landscape due to the interplay between local non-linearity and spatial variation leads to regional coexistence. Right, now I wish I had my notes. Okay, so that's this, right? The scale transition. You have that variability, you get something in. But there's a third player here. Can somebody point to that? Indeed. We haven't talked about dispersal. So we see that the interplay between local dynamics and spatial variation can lead to regional coexistence. In some ways, that's no show, right? It's here and it's here. They're not really coexisting, right? They're not really interacting. So then we can ask this question. If you can get regional coexistence through that interplay, could the interplay between local dynamics, spatial variation, and dispersal possibly lead to local coexistence? That means within each locality, which we know is a hard problem. Right, so that's what we are going to look at. So here's the argument that I'm going to give you first, and then we are going to go through it. Given spatial variation in competitive ability, dispersal between localities can lead to local coexistence through sourcing dynamics, okay? That means nothing, but we're going to go through and understand it. So here are the elements of our problem. We are in a patchy environment where there are many localities. There's spatial variation in competitive ability because of some underlying abiotic factor that affects fitness or per capita growth rate. And there is emigration and immigration between patches, which occurs on the same time scale as local dynamics. This is not extinctions and colonizations that happen over longer time scales, okay? What is emigration? The departure of organisms from their natal or focal resident locality, immigration of the influx, right? When these occur on the same time as local dynamics, what can happen? They can actually alter the nature of local dynamics, right? So that's the important thing, and that can happen in unexpected ways. So we're going to study, for the purposes of this lecture, a two-patch, two-species meta-community because it's easier to understand. The ideas are generalizable to n-patch, m-species. Here's a mathematical model, and finally, that's a log-cover model. You've seen this before. So we are going to look at a mathematical model of competition and dispersal. This part you've seen before. You have an intrinsic growth rate, intraspecific competition, interspecific competition. For ease of interpretation, I've assumed that the intraspecific alphas are scale to 1, so which is easier, right? That we know it has to be less than 1 or greater than 1. So that's competition. You've seen that before. Now, they are in different patches as well. This is one patch, two species, but then you have some n number of patches in the landscape. This is the emigration term. So function of the species, resident species density, density independent, and that's the immigration term. So as a point of departure, we are considering that dispersal is random. It's not influenced by habitat quality, density, or any other aspect of the environment. We can go there, but first we need to learn this, okay? Right. Now we are going to make some simplifying assumptions. We are going to consider, since our question is about the interplay between competition and dispersal, we are going to assume the species differ in those traits, but are similar otherwise as a first kind. So this simplifies the model. Oops, I think I missed something. Oh yes, sorry. We are going to non-dimensionalize this model. Now you're all experts at it. I would suggest doing this for the logistic. Did we do logistic? Yeah, you've done the logistic. Try it for Lorca-Volta with the competition model without dispersal, and then try it, and you get something like this. So here we do the same thing, abundance by carrying capacity, but there's another element here. You have the carrying capacity of the same species in different patches, right? So we have to take care of that. So you have that, and this is one important thing here that's different. This is the emigration rate, which is scaled by the species, resource species, the species growth rate. Okay, so that's, you can tell, which is important because that is telling you relative to the growth rate, how many individuals are leaving a patch. If there's a large influx of emigrants, the growth rate in the patch could go negative, right? Because this is what I said about dispersal directly affects local dynamics. So that's important. And then as usual, here we are going to scale time by the resident competitors. X is the resident species here, okay? And Y is the inmate or the second species, the time. And then we are going to assume that they differ in their competitive and dispersal abilities, and everything else is the same across species. And we get this somewhat simpler model, but with still the essential elements. We have the alphas that determine the interspecific competition, and the emigration, the betas, which specify the dispersal rate. And we are going to compute the innovation criterion to ask, can the inferior competitor increase when rare in any given patch when the superior competitor is at carrying capacity? So we do this. The only difference here is this is a two-patch model. So now you're constructing a Jacobian for a two-patch model. Now Simon Levin did something like this in 1974 with the same sort of, not this model, but something like that. So it's an interesting take on the thing. So here you do the Jacobian as much as you would do for two equations. Here's the thing, we are going to evaluate the Jacobian at the boundary equilibrium of each species in two patches, right? 1 and 2 in patch 1, 1 and 2 in patch 2, but across the landscape, only the superior competitor is present, okay? And it's at 1 because we scale the carrying capacity, the abundance by carrying capacity. You understand, we're starting in a system where only this species is present in the entire landscape, and we ask, can the next species, the other species invade, okay? And going through the algebra gives you the dominant eigenvalue for that Jacobian. And if it's positive, we know that the second species can invade, right? And that's given by this solution to the quadratic, where B is given by this and C is given by this. Now I want you to, so the nice thing here is it's framed only in terms of alphas and the betas, right? Competition and dispersal. Now then, so look at this invasion criterion very carefully. So this is what I said about these things. That is also why I'm not going through the thing. I want you to look at, once you get it, what these terms mean, okay? So here, this is the initial per capita growth rate of the inferior competitor in patch I in the absence of dispersal. Do you agree? Here, it's what is the per capita growth rate in the absence of dispersal? Is this term, right? But intraspecific competition is very low when you're rare. So it's 1 minus that, right? So you get this is the, and why is there nothing else here? Because the other species is at 1, right? You understand? Because everything got scaled. We can deal with that later. So this is correct, but here, this is the initial per capita growth rate of the inferior competitor in the absence of dispersal. And look at these two terms. The first term is the product of the initial per capita growth rates in the two patches, the multiplicative effect of fitness. The second term is the sum of the initial per capita growth rates in the two patches, the additive effect, and scale by dispersal. So as we said, I'm going to claim invasion is possible, only possible in a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. To show this, let's first look at invasion in a spatially homogeneous competitive environment. Means the superior competitor is superior everywhere. So that means we can simplify these things across the landscape. Then there's no difference in competition coefficients, right? Because it's the same everywhere. Homogeneous, right? There's no difference in competitive abilities. So this one is less than 1, and for the invader, it's greater than 1. What does that mean? Inferior competitor has very little effect, less than. The superior competitor is limited more by itself than the invader. The opposite is true for the invader. This is right? That's just the Lotka-Volter criteria. It's a little different because I've scaled it, rescaled it. So then you get this is the invasion criterion. Again, we stare at, and then, sorry, this is the full invasion criterion. In a homogeneous environment, it simplifies to this because there is no difference between patches. Thank you. So now recall that this is negative, right? Because this is the inferior competitor. So its initial per capita growth rate in the absence of dispersal is negative because it always gets excluded, right? This means the sum of initial growth rates is negative. The product is positive. Negative positive plays a huge role here. Since the sum of the initial growth rates is negative and the product is positive, can this be satisfied? No. The inferior competitor, we have proved the obvious, cannot invade when we are in a spatially homogeneous competitive environment. Right. So we can't get local coexistence because the relative strengths of intra and interspecific competition are the same everywhere in the landscape. Now let's look at the real problem, right? Now we see what is the obvious case. What happens in a competitively heterogeneous environment? Now, initial per capita growth rate is negative in the patch that is unfavorable, positive in the patch that's favorable. You agree? How many people disagree? Are you raising your hand? Okay. This means that the product of the initial growth rate is always negative. What does that mean? Invasibility depends on the sum of the initial growth rates, right? Isn't that beautiful? We just found something out by just staring at that thing, right? So, yeah. No, this is a heterogeneous case. No, you can't, because the first you subtract a positive from a negative. Yeah, okay. Now, this is interesting, right? Now we are going to look at the case when there's strong spatial variation in competitive ability. What does that mean? The fitnesses are very different in the two patches. In one, it has a huge advantage. In the other, it's barely hanging in, right? If not, yeah. So then, here's the thing. If the positive initial growth rate in the favorable locality is sufficiently high, relative to the growth rate in the unfavorable locality, this can become positive. Agree? Because beta is always positive. Beta 0, we have no show here, right? Then, what do you say about this? That's negative. Right? What about if the sum is positive? Is this satisfied? Always satisfied, right? Doesn't matter what beta is. Does everyone agree? I want you to be comfortable with that. Yeah? You see? Why is this positive? Because it's like having 100 in one place and minus 10 in the other place. It's still 90, right? So you're subtracting a positive quantity from a negative quantity, right? So that's negative. In this case, invasion is possible under any level of dispersal. The magnitude of the dispersal rate doesn't matter if there's very high spatial variation in fitness. You just need enough individuals to move between patches. Now we have and also in this particular case, because this is a Lotka-Walter model, the coexistence equilibrium is stable when it's feasible. What is feasible? It can exist. There is an interior equilibrium, right? And invasibility actually guarantees long-term coexistence, unlike in the other models I talked about. Now then, now let's look at when spatial variation in fitness is weak. Okay, you're doing better, but you're not doing that much better. Now, if the positive growth rate in the favorable locality is small in magnitude relative to the negative growth rate in the unfavorable locality, the sum can be negative, right? Now it's like plus 40 and minus 60, right? So what happens? Now the relative magnitude of dispersal is going to be important. Here is a diagram where the x-axis is the spatial variation in the strength of competition, the difference in fitness, so it increases. Here, spatial variation in competitive ability, meaning on this axis, here there's a very strong difference in fitness. Here, there's minimal difference, and this is the per capita emigration rate beta. And what you can see, high spatial variation is there's a competitive advantage in the source is very high relative to the competitive disadvantage in the sink. Low spatial variation means the competitive advantage in the source is low relative to the disadvantage in the sink. So here's the important point. When spatial variation is high, coexistence is possible as long as beta x is non-negative, yeah? No, I think it's a ratio of like, so it's a metric of how strong so this is 3 times, like the difference is 3 times. Yeah, sorry? I can't actually remember. I'll look it up and tell you. It's a, yeah, it's, I was thinking about that myself because it's a paper I did in like some time back, but it's a legitimate index. So it's something, yeah, exactly. It's something like that. It's a ratio. Yeah, it's a ratio. So because it's 3 times the difference or something like that. So, and I've scaled it also. So here's the point, important point. When spatial variation is high, this is local coexistence, remember? This is now within a locality, right? And it's actually stable local coexistence, where before you had competitive exclusion. So when spatial variation is low, coexistence is possible only if beta is below a critical threshold. So this is the boundary, okay? When beta exceeds that, the species goes extinct from the entire landscape, and you end up worse than you were before, okay?
It's the ratio because then one is spatially homogeneous. There shouldn't be any correlation.
No, so let's not worry about that because as I told you that I can't quite remember, but that's a valid index of spatial differences, okay? So the point here is that if you have high, which actually is pretty intuitive, you have very high fitness one place and very low fitness somewhere else, your dispersal is not going to equalize fitness. So which is what, so why is high dispersal detrimental to coexistence? So here, let me summarize. Shh. Do you have questions? Okay. When spatial variation in competitive ability is low, high dispersal, here's why. When you have too much dispersal, you're going to eliminate your fitness difference, right? It's the homogenizing effect of high dispersal. Too many individuals come in to the patch where you have a disadvantage. Why would you do that? Is it non-adaptive? It's not going to happen. But if it were to happen, then the species would be excluded from the. So remember, this is an ecological model. We are not thinking about adaptive dispersal. Obviously, with adaptive dispersal, you would probably, wouldn't have that, but this is what we find. Now, that's all sort of obvious. Okay, so they move and they get, but there's a slightly non-obvious thing, which is that you actually get stable local coexistence. You actually get a stable fixed point. That's stable to perturbations. How would you get that when you were initially being excluded, right? So this gets us to the question of how does dispersal allow local coexistence? So the simple answer is the inferior competitor can hang in there as long as there's immigration, but that's not a stable situation, right? Then when that is susceptible to perturbations, you could still get excluded under certain circumstances. Here, so we know, and here's one of those places where you go back to first principles and try to come up with a hypothesis for what could be happening. So we know that for coexistence to occur, species must limit themselves more than they do others. Yes. Yeah. You also have these notes actually. Yeah. So, which means in our universe, intraspecific competition has to exceed interspecific competition. So what can you say then if dispersal allows coexistence, stable coexistence, what must it be doing? What must it be doing? I thought somebody would have, I had all these questions and I gave you the notes and I thought all the surprise element is taken away. Yeah. It must be somehow, exactly, increasing the strength of intraspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions, right? Is that possible? This is just random dispersal. So we know coexistence. So again, what I said about starting from the beginning, from principles. So we know this. We don't have any idea what's happening, but we know this requires some sort of negative feedback, which means negative density dependence in the species per capita growth rate. So we can see one thing we could do is to compare the per capita growth rates, 1 second, in isolated and connected communities. Okay, so here, this is the per capita growth rate in the absence of dispersal. It's a logistic model. You have linear density dependence, right? In the lot coverture competition. So basically in the So that is what you get. This is the per capita growth rate in the presence of dispersal. And you can see dispersal generates nonlinear density dependence in the per capita growth rate and enhances the negative density dependence that occurs due to intra-specific competition for resources. You see that, right? So that is the thing. In the connected community, you have this. The isolated community is simply Lotka-Volterra linear thing. So what does this mean? This means with this nonlinear density dependence induced by random dispersal, you have a higher growth rate at low abundances, right? Which means enhances the ability of species to recover from low density or increase from initially small numbers. It has a lower growth rate at high abundances, which means it also increases the strength of negative density dependence and allows stable, increases the stability of the coexistence equilibrium. Yeah. I'll show you. We are going to find out exactly in a formal way, okay? So having seen that, that's just a graph, right? So obviously this is abundance, this is a per capita growth rate, okay? So this is a plot of per capita growth rate versus density, obviously, like the usual thing. So what's interesting is what this gives us is stable local coexistence of species that were before getting excluded, right? They were getting excluded. Now, let's just try to formalize this. What is this negative feedback due to dispersal? Can we actually see that in a kind of a formal mathematical sense? So here's our equation system. Now let's look at the per capita growth rate of the inferior competitor. You know, the one that we care about because the other one can come. So when you get, how do you get the per capita growth rate? You divide this equation by x, right? Yeah. So then you get, look, that's all fine. You saw that before, but look at this term. You have to divide it by the species abundance, right? Because that's a function of the abundance of the other patch. What does that do? You see, per capita growth rate now becomes a non-linearly decreasing function of density. See, that's 1 over x, right? Through the immigration term, because immigration is unrelated to the, it's like having a consumer term in your equation. We saw that, right? That does not generate negative feedback in the per capita growth rate. This generates negative density dependence over and above that due to intra-specific competition. You see the beauty of it, right? That it's not just like, oh, some individuals are coming in. It's that it actually creates a fundamental change in the local nonlinear dynamics. All right, so is it 1 o'clock? How much time do you have? Okay. So let me just summarize this. Dispersal generates a negative density dependent effect, which increases the strength of intraspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions and promotes coexistence at the local level. So we can answer our question. Remember, we saw that the interplay between local dynamics and spatial variation can lead to regional coexistence. We asked the question, can the interplay between local dynamics, spatial variation, and dispersal lead to local coexistence? And the answer is an emphatic yes. Okay. Right. So I have 25 minutes. I'm going to do my best to try to get the next part. Okay. What I suggest is like I will make myself available for questions because I know we had some difficulties today. So if you have anything confusing, just ask me afterwards, because I have absolutely no time to take this lecture to my third lecture. There's temporal variation and there's things I really want to tell you before I leave the country, okay? All right, so it's not about me watching tigers either, it's actually science.
Slot for tomorrow.
Yeah, but I think people are going home. Okay, well, I mean, I could stay around. Yeah, I could stick around. So, right. We could always do it at a pub. Just saying. Just saying. I probably said something illegal there. Okay, mutualistic interactions. So mutualistic interactions are interesting for two reasons, many reasons, but two reasons. One is there is inherent positive feedback in the species per capita growth rates due to this thing called alley effects. You know, you have, what is that? So the per capita growth rate decreases with decreasing density, right? Why does that happen? You run out of mates. You don't have food, right? So it's interesting because of the positive feedback, but it's also interesting because the existence of alley effects increase the risk of extinction of mutualistic interactions due to anthropogenic perturbations such as habitat fragmentation. They are very fragile, in other words. When they are driven to low densities, they can't actually increase from small numbers unless they are above that threshold. Okay, right. So we are going to look at this using a model, very simple one, so this is a model of a mutualistic interaction in a spatially heterogeneous environment. We are considering an obligate mutualism in which the partners are dependent, entirely dependent, and cannot survive. Actually, at least one partner in this one. And we are going to, as a point of departure, consider pairwise interaction between a mobile and non-mobile species. The obvious examples are plants and pollinators, or plants and seed dispersers. And we consider the dispersal of the mobile mutualists. So this is like a bee or a hummingbird or whoever else, birds, dispersers, pollinators, seed dispersers, okay? Frugivores. So the local dynamics are given by this occupancy model. Okay, so it's a complete departure from what we've done before, where a given locality consists of three types of patches. You have empty patches where nobody is present. You have patches where just the plant. So, sorry, I'm going to frame this in terms of plants and pollinators, just for ease of presentation, but this could in principle apply to any other facilitative interaction. So you have patches with just the plant, and you have patches with plant and pollinator. Now, why do we have plant-only patches? Because the plant can survive for some length of time. It's the reproduction that's curtailed by the lack of a pollinator, right? So that you can have the plant persisting in the patches for some time, but all reproduction occurs in the plant pollinator patches. So here, P1 is the frequency of proportion of patches that consist only of plants. P2 is the proportion of patches that consist of both. And we can write down equations for these proportions. This is the rate of production of the plant-only patches. This is the rate of production of plant pollinator patches through the colonization of a plant-only patch by a pollinator. And these are the loss rates, okay? Now, I'm introducing you to this model that has actually a hierarchical spatial structure, 3 levels. A patch is not a locality. A patch is an individual organism, like an individual plant, okay? And within a locality, a local community, you have a collection of patches, which is a collection of individuals of, if it's a plant-only patch, just plants, plant pollinator, individuals of plants and individuals of pollinators that hang about in that area, right? And then there's a third scale of the collection of local communities, which is your meta community. It's almost like a deterministic version of an individual base model, right? Because you actually have individuals. And this also gets us out of kind of assuming carrying capacity or something, because we're really looking at the birth death of individuals. All of which I'm not going to have time to show you, but I can refer you to the papers. Here, I'm going to show a phase diagram. The abundance of the plant pollinator patches on the x-axis, abundance of the plant-only patches. This is the zero growth isocline for the plant pollinator patches. That's the this is the zero growth isocycline for the plant patches. This is the zero growth isocycline for the plant pollinator patches. Very much similar to a consumer resource thing, because the consumer, like the pollinator, abundance is constant. But look, there are three sets of steady states. Extinction is a stable equilibrium. Below this saddle, if the abundances of the two species are below that saddle point, the interaction goes extinct. That's due to the alley effect. If they're above, you go to this stable equilibrium. Okay, so the point is that because of the alley effect, the species cannot increase when rare. So the question is then, can spatial variation counteract the alley effect and allow species to increase when rare? That's an isolated locality, right? There's nothing else but the positive density dependence, and the possible potential for extinction is abundances fall below the alley threshold. So here now we are going to look at the spatial dynamics through the dispersal between two communities, two localities, each with its own community. And we have the random dispersal of the mobile mutualist, meaning the pollinator, the plant. Obviously, the plant is not going to go from one patch to the other, at least not in a real sense, unless somebody does something. Now, the plant pollinator, the function for the birth of the plant pollinator patches has two additional quantities. It's a function of the proportion of plant pollinator patches in the other locality. It's like remember the emigration rate is a function of the beta times the abundance. Is exactly the same thing. And the quantity I here denotes the mode of dispersal between patches. So when I first developed this, I had two types of dispersal, active and passive, which we are not going to worry about, but that just determines dispersal. So that's then the production of plant pollinator patches. Everything else is the same. This is the only thing that has changed. Yeah.
What do the indices signify? The IJ, what does I and J stand?
So I think the one is plant patch in locality J. Okay. 2 is plant pollinator in locality J, and the localities are 1 and 2.
And then what is K?
K is the other locality. So you're in J. Yeah. So I mean, it's only 2, but it's 2 species and 2 localities, but in general, yeah. So now we are going to look at the phase diagrams in the isolated community and the connected community. So we see that in the isolated community, there is an alley effect. Species cannot increase when they are rare. In the connected community, there's no alley effect. Species can now increase when rare and attain a stable equilibrium. So here, dispersal is itself density independent, but it generates this negative density dependent effect that counteracts the positive density dependence due to the alley effect. Now we see for one thing, it doesn't depend. This is a fundamental mechanism that doesn't depend on the kind of model you use, right? Before we had an actual explicit dynamics model with immigration and emigration occurring on the same time scale. Here you have an occupancy model, and we still get the same outcome. So what happens is that patches that are in danger of extinction or the mutualistic interaction are rescued from extinction through dispersal. And we want to look at the mechanism of this rescue effect, and it's the same as before. This is the per capita growth rate in the plant pollinator patches versus the abundance. And as we saw before, in an isolated locality, it doesn't change, right? It's like the consumer isocline, except this goes this way now, right? And in the connected community, we see actually not just density dependence, non-linear density dependence, right? This thing has become that thing. So to kind of belabor the point that I've been belaboring for a while now, dispersal generates this negative density dependent effect similar to intraspecific competition, but not actual limitation of interaction competition of resources. Per capita growth rate is high when the abundance is low, allows species to increase when where, and that's why we see this, right? That's why we see this. Okay. So that's the mechanistic basis of it. Dispersal increases the strength of the intraspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions. And through that, we get spatial coexistence of mutualistic species when there's positive density dependence in the local dynamics, but there's spatial variation in fitness, and dispersal generates negative density dependence, can actually oppose an L effect. Okay, not just by sending an influx of individuals, but by actually modifying the species, the feedbacks within a locality. So, spatial coexistence of mutualistic species, negative density dependence generated by dispersal counteracts what I just said. Right, with that, we are coming to the end of this lecture, which by some miracle I have actually managed, I think. Is it just like 5 to 1?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, after 1. Anyway, not too bad, right? Okay, so that's the spatial variation part of it. And I have not, so again, as I said, I've given you a lot of ideas, not necessarily going through them in detail. And we see that even that I almost didn't make it because of the issues. But if we hadn't had that, I could have had more time. But I'm willing to stay maybe like tomorrow at any time if you want more details. And I'm immediately
also in the tutorial today.
Yeah, and I'm immediately going to look up the index of spatial variation. I'll let you know how I actually calculated it. I had to go back and look at my paper. But that's those are the main ideas that if you want, the take-home thing here is when you talk about heterogeneity, it's not just the environmental variation. Does it make a difference? Does it generate spatial variance in fitness? And if it does, that alone can have the emergent effect of species being able to persist in different parts of the landscape. And on top of that, if those different parts of the landscape are such that they can still be within the distance that species can traverse, then you can also get local coexistence, not just sort of through just an influx that can go away and be extinction prone, but actually somewhat stably, obviously, as long as you have that influx of individuals from another patch. And it doesn't have to be a very large number, as we saw. Okay. In fact, when the spatial variance in fitness is now very high, the dispersal rate shouldn't be too high, because in that case, dispersal can homogenize the fitness differences between patches. Okay, and that actually used to be a big deal sometime, I think like 10 years ago, about the we know this, like synchronizing effects of dispersal by equalizing fitness differences. And we've seen an interesting manifestation of that here in this competition model. And that you can extend this to other species interactions. So we've seen already one with to a facilitative interaction, but you can also ask the same question with consumer resource, which is interesting because they're antagonistic, right? So you would almost think the prey would want to disperse away somewhere the predators are, whereas the predators want to go the other way, right? So then you have this conflict of interest. Anyway, with that, we can go to lunch.